Hey, good afternoon. My name is Renika. I work for communications for the Equity Education Coalition, and today's Lunch and Learn is on equity within special education. I'm going to give an opportunity for each of the panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves, and we can start with. And also, if you're asking a question or if you're on the panel, just to speak up because we do have microphones around, but because we are live for people who can't attend.
Thank you. My name is Scott Robb, and I work at the Office of the Superintendent for Public Instruction. That's OSPI in the Special Ed Division. My role is the Parent and Community Liaison for the office.
And good morning. My name is Liz Stewart, or afternoon. My name is Liz Stewart. I'm also with OSPI. I'm one of the program supervisors there.
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Butcher. First and foremost, I'm a parent. So I have 3 boys, all of whom have received special education services. I also am co-founder of SEL for Washington and Roots of Inclusion. SEL for Washington focuses on social emotional learning and advocating for that work. And Roots of Inclusion is honestly, it's just born out of the work I've done in community and across the state to really kind of connecting stakeholders and working together differently to improve outcomes for students with disabilities.
Hi, my name is Patty Gonzalez. I work for the ARC of King County as a parent-to-parent coordinator for the Spanish-speaking families.
My name is Richard Mullen. I work with the ARC of King County. I run the African American Family Support Program, as well as partnering with the Parent-to-Parent program and the Advocacy program. Ramona Hattendorf is currently moving her car. So she's the director of advocacy within the ARC of King County and leader of advocacy engagements at the ARC of King County.
Perfect. Okay, so for our first question, just to get started, for those of us who don't know very well on what is special education, if you guys could define for us, like what does special education mean? And is it just for children who are on the spectrum?
You want to take that one,
Sure, I
Scott?
can. It's kind of a regulatory thing in nature, but you can expound upon it. If we're going to define sort of what is special education, I think it's the sort of hallmark or the major characteristic is that it's a student who has a disability, number one. Number two, that disability somehow impacts the student, or there's an adverse impact from the disability. And then the really important, I think, key thing is that the impact is such that the student requires some kind of specially designed instruction. So like special ed is specialized instruction to address the needs that arise from the disability that a student has. And there are 13 federal categories by which we define the disability. So it's not just students who may be on the spectrum. There's a whole range of needs the students may have. And then the processes that the school district would go through is to evaluate what is the adverse impact and what is the need for specialized instruction or specially designed instruction, as it's called. SDI, we'll call it for short a lot. If a student has needs that rise to that level, then they would be qualified or eligible to receive special education services as a result.
Okay. So I guess another question that I would have is, does special education get funded adequately?
No, it doesn't. I mean, you could look historically at the federal level, special education has never been fully funded federally. And I would think that it's not very controversial to say that, at the state level, sure, we could always use more funding to, support students. So, I mean, from that standpoint, I would say no, I don't know special ed has ever really been fully funded. There hasn't been a commitment to fund special ed to the point where there's the need of all the students. Or anyone else wants to add on that?
I would just add as well that often when we're thinking about special education funding, we're thinking about some of the program costs, but what often isn't always thought about is that our students with disabilities are in general education, they're general education students first. And so how do we make sure we're adequately funding our basic education formula to support an inclusive environment? So for example, students who receive special education services also are covered under an additional law called Section 504 that has to do with accommodations in particular that's needed. And Section 504 is not funded at all, right? So we have a gap in our special education funding, but I personally would also argue that we have a lot of costs we push onto special education that we aren't funding within our basic education funding formula.
Yeah, just to add to that, because there's, in many conversations I have with families who call the state office, there's this question of, how much money does a school district get for my specific student? So special ed funding isn't necessarily tied to a student doesn't equal a certain dollar amount. There's a funding formula that is tied to the basic education allocation for school districts. So it has more to do with headcount than it does an actual individual student's need. And then that being said, our state does have what's called a safety net, which is essentially a high cost pool of money that school districts can apply for to get a reimbursement or an award to cover the cost of students who are sort of disproportionately more expensive to serve when it comes to their needs. So there's different ways in which, yes, we try to cover all the costs related to the needs of students. And the basic education idea, I think, is really central, that first and foremost, just because a student receives additional services doesn't mean they're not still a general education, basic education student first and foremost. And that's why the funding formula is sort of tied together in that respect, that the more general ed funding there is, that would also benefit any student in special ed as well.
And again, I would just add one additional piece of information to that without getting too far into the weeds, is that when we look at how we fund students through general education, that formula is actually tied to adults and kind of time, not taking into account student need, which starts to exacerbate, right, the inequities that we see within our structures of funding. So it's a complex issue, but it's a very important one, because often I know families here, we don't have the resources for that, right? Can often be something they hear when they're asking for additional supports for their student.
Hi. So I'd also like to add, and I apologize, I had to move my car. Somebody might have mentioned this, but with special education, something that we're very concerned about at the ARC and some other organizations is the cap, essentially. So a school district only gets money in the special ed allocation up to a certain percentage of their student body. And I think is it 13.5 now? And so that assumes, so you either get your actual number, so say you have 9%, then you get funding up to 9%. But if you have 15%, you don't get 15%. If you have 20%, you don't get 20%. And so it assumes sort of an even distribution of special education students, and that's just not the way it works in the real world for a variety of reasons. And particularly it impacts small communities, rural communities, and our analysis, it really impacts a lot of tribal schools. It impacts schools that are serving, for whatever reason, a lot of Native Americans. And so it's a very inequitable structure in the framing of the underlying assumptions that it makes. And I would also add then the multiplier is tied to your basic allocation for your school. So if you are a school that gets extra money because you're a high income area and your staffing allocation is higher, you get more special education funding. If you are a school district that doesn't get as high an allocation for salaries because your cost of living is high, you get a lower distribution for special education. So there's a lot of inconsistencies in the special education funding formula that really serve some communities not so well.
We tend to leave questions for the end, so if you have questions, remember it, and we'll get together. Perfect. So, and I will say now, we have so many questions and so little time, so the topic kind of does bounce around a little bit, just so you guys are aware of that. And I heard you guys throw out the number 504 a couple times, and one, if you guys could explain what that means for folks who don't know, and then also, is a school legally obligated to follow a student's 504 or IEP plan?
Scott?
The second half of that question is a lot easier, so I'll take that first, where yes, the obligation is to follow the 504 plan or the IEP that's written. A student wouldn't necessarily have both. You get one or the other based on the needs that the student has. Although it's important to note that 504 is in reference to a civil rights law, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So when we say a 504 plan, it's in essence a plan to ensure that a student who has a disability that poses a major limitation on major life activity, they still have equal access or equal opportunity to access school. And so it has that broader mandate or broader concept. And it's a civil rights statute, so it covers any individual with a disability, any student with a disability. So if the distinction is that if a student is eligible for special education services, they're still, first and foremost, to receive special ed, they still have to be a student with a disability. So they're protected from discrimination under Section 504, even though they have the additional requirement or the additional need for special ed services. So once a student has demonstrated or the school district has determined really that the student needs special ed services, then they would receive an IEP instead of a 504 plan, even though anything that would protect the student under civil rights law still applies to the protections on an IEP. So I know that distinction gets lost a little bit, but the main distinction I think to keep in mind is that students who have a Section 504 or a 504 plan, they don't receive specialized instruction. They receive accommodations, related services to ensure equal access or equal opportunity. Students who require specialized instruction or specially designed instruction, those are the students that have an IEP, and that IEP is an individual education program that's all encompassing of the accommodations, related services, and instruction that the student needs as a result of their disability. I think that's the key difference. And as we said before, their obligation is to follow both plans. I mean, whatever is a written plan, that's what school districts would be held accountable to.
And then from my folks from ARC, do immigrant and or Latinx parents know what it means when their child gets an IEP or a 504 plan?
You want to go first? Go. Okay. So most times when I speak with families of color, the narrative is confusion pertaining to IEP support. What we're talking about here, you guys did a very good job of the systemic approach to, support, but actual application is where we find a lot of trouble. So when parents call my office, it's mostly because they have a lack of understanding information and what their rights are around the IEP plan that they've been given. And so we spend a lot of time navigating the system, how to engage with the teacher, and how to communicate the proper accommodations for the student. That's kind of our experience. I mean, I could spend hours talking to you about, the different levels of that. But I don't like to offer a problem without offering the solution. I feel the solution is very simple. Up front, parents don't have support around understanding the fundamentals of what an IEP actually is. How to use it. A lot of them don't know that it's a legal document, and that's very significant, right? And then also, I feel that we need to invest more time in just training on how to communicate one's thoughts regarding their children to the teachers and faculty. A lot of times there is misunderstanding because of cultural differences, the way we communicate, the way we feel we're being looked at, the way we feel we're being perceived, the way the teachers feel they're being perceived. So they're not actually able to keep the main thing the main thing. So if there was a support, I would say like an intro to having an IEP class, or having someone who could champion informing parents of regarding what their rights are, basically doing our job. because that's what we do when they call. We inform them of what an IEP is, what their rights are, how to speak to your teacher, how to build relationships with faculty at their school and in the district. It's a need, and we need to be conscious that what you don't know can hurt you. And I tell teachers that I talk to some teachers, but I tell parents that all the time, that if we're not informing the parents, they're just going to go with what they know, and then the situation is going to become problematic. You're going to have breakdown, and then hopefully you find someone who can support you to unpack the damage that's been done. If you're in a K through 12 setting, these are teachers that you're going to be spending your whole, or that large part of your academic experience with. So, having the information, feeling supported, being given clear directives on how, everyone can come together to help the student should be the priority. So it's using the tools, the 504, the IEP, those are tools, but support around applying those tools in a way that helps the student have a fruitful future, and also the teachers as well. Teachers are overwhelmed because IEPs are specific for the individual. I get questions like, is this a good IEP? Well, really, an IEP is customized to the individual, meaning every single IEP is different, and there are different accommodations that are necessary, meaning that family and that child need the proper supports for that to be successful. Everyone being on the same page is really hard. So having someone or having a team that could help support the IEP team and the individual would really, really, really be great. And if there are organizations out there that do this type of work, I would love to connect with you, because I have a lot of parents who are asking, where is the support? Why don't I know these things? My kid's in 5th grade. He's had an IEP since kindergarten. And, I don't like to blame or point the finger, but like I said, the solution can very simply be laid out as, we need to add more information and support, and then also back that with supports on de-escalation when you are in a situation where you feel you've been wronged or you feel you've been misled, how to navigate that and build positive relationships with your teacher and faculty at the school.
For the immigrants families, as a Latinos, there is a lot of similar things like the African Americans, but also the language barrier. It is one component, but also being immigrant, yes, it is very difficult, because there is a lot of emotions that is affecting the fact to be engaged. And then also the system have been misconceived or manipulate the form of the engagement that they have been doing with the families, because they welcome them, but when they are needed a service, they are not providing the services. Because when the school districts provide the interpreters are not qualified. Sometimes the interpreters say whatever they want to say, because I personally have that experience. And also, sometimes they summarize that information. Or sometimes the interpreters don't have idea about what they are talking about. They don't have any sense about about what is a special education means. Sometimes the parent has to explain to the interpreters what they are talking about, when even the parents don't understand what the IB means, when they don't know what a special education is in place for their kids. So sometimes the parents misunderstand the conference and about the IB meetings. And the schools don't spend no time to explain in advance to what the IPs is going to be implemented, how they can work together as a team, what part of the team are the parents are. They don't explain nothing at all. And also, sometimes they say because they don't have a time. Sometimes the students they graduate from the high school and the parents didn't know that their kids were in the special education. So sometimes the students lost the opportunity to be in the transition program because the teachers graduate from the high school, and that's all. And then if they don't have a legal status, there is more huge barriers because sometimes the teacher don't see them like an individual who could be able to do something in the community. But it's not just to be able to work or find a job. It is more about to build the skills to be independent, to be like us. So there is a huge gap on that things that also because the misconception of about the cultural component. They take an advance like this is ESL the students, and then they will not be able to learn because of disability, because they are immigrants, because there is a lot of work that they have to do. Because I hear them. I have that experience. I hear a teacher playing about my son because he has a disability. She clearly told me she was tired to working with my son. So if I have that experience, I can imagine how other parents are having the same things. So I know there is a lot of teachers who have the passion to do their jobs, but it's so hard to find a good teachers. It is so hard to find a staff who really wants to implement what they're supposed to be doing.
I just would like to add one of the things, both in my own experience, but also in my work with families. It's hard to imagine until you're in it what that IEP process feels like, right? We have very stressed out schools. They have minimal time. They're just trying to get through the process. And as a parent, you're walking in and like it should be typical that you hear the strengths of your child, but usually it's like they're happy or they seem to smile all the time. It never feels like it's genuinely anchored in a knowing of the student. And what's focused on is all the things that are wrong that need to be fixed, right? And so it's just very anxiety producing. It doesn't feel good. I can coach parents all day long around those meetings, but when I walk into my own, I'm a mess, right? And so when we think about that capacity building, it's not only helping parents understand and know the laws, it's what can we, as all the stakeholders involved, the schools, the system, the family advocacy groups, how can we come together and talk about how can those IEP meetings feel better? We're going to be much more likely to get the work done if it doesn't feel so overwhelming and negative about the student, right? And so what would that even look like? I think the other piece, and I recognize this with families, I recognized quickly when I started the process that the privilege I hold, what a benefit that was. And it was overwhelming to me to think about that it was based on luck, really, that my child was going to get what he needed because he had a mom that understood the U.S. education system, could quickly read up on the laws and rules and understand all this, and then push forward, and how absolutely unreasonable that is, right? And so this happens every day in our communities, that what a child and a family gets access to is based on luck, and that should outrage all of us. And that also is a slippery slope, because the number of families I know whose child has been in a car accident or something, all of a sudden they find themselves in the world of special ed, right? Like, we should never assume that we will never have to encounter that system. And when we do, we better want it to work. In addition, I would say as adults, we haven't really built capacity within our schools and systems as quickly as we need to understand bias, right? We do not have healthy and positive disability identity. How that plays into this process is problematic. And then when we are working with our families and students of color, our immigrant and refugee families, like, how do we help individuals understand the bias and how that's going to play into how they show up and how we move through that process? So needless to say, there's a lot of work to be done. And I'm really heartened by all the people that are here, because it will take all of us working together differently in order to get the changes to happen.
I would also add, thank you for sharing that. A lot of times the families that I support, one thing, if I could pick out one emotion that is consistent when they come for support, is a fear of not being prepared and having to speak up and advocate for their child. So I don't want to continue to ride this horse, but we spend a lot of time teaching them what their rights are and what the IEP process actually should be. If I don't have a child with developmental or intellectual disability, or physical disability, but I'll say, in that scenario, when you're going into a room of people who are making decisions about your child and you don't feel confident that you understand what's being said and you don't know if the accommodations that are being recommended will actually bear good fruit, it's a very stressful place to be. And so I feel as though an actual IEP meeting should be a formality. It should be a place where you're coming to sign off on a plan that you've already had dialogue about. So I recommend parents to start an email chain, start asking these questions regarding the supports, the IEP, the teacher, progress reports, documenting those things in email form far before that IEP meeting, because I get the collateral damage after the IEP meeting blows up and the parents are disgruntled. The teachers are stressed out because a lot of teachers actually do want to help the students. There are some that have strong bias. There are some systemic issues that don't favor African American men, young men especially, but young girls as well. But not every teacher is trying to sabotage their student by way of an IEP meeting, right? We have to figure out a way to inform the parents and teach them how to properly advocate for their child in a way that's, I would just say, non-aggressive. I mean, and by way of being able to peacefully, being in an environment where they can talk peacefully about accommodations, rather than the narrative being I have to duke it out to get what I want, and that's just kind of the way things are done. Because a lot of times that's what parents, they come to me and they're ready for a fight. You know, they're talking about lawyers that they can't afford because they are trying to support their loved one. So simplifying all of that, if we could just connect the parents with the proper information. So because we know the IEP process. If you don't, you get an evaluation, and then the results of that evaluation determine if you get an IEP. Once you get that IEP, you have basically a list of things to go through. But the IEP is essentially about accommodations for the success of the student. So up front, if the parent could get the information that they need to start to grow in their understanding of what this process really looks like, I feel that it will lower the stress level because the parents will be more confident. The student will feel more supported because they're actually getting things that they need. And the teachers can be less stressed because they are wearing less hats. So if you're trying to teach someone something and then also trying to get something signed off, and then also and this is just one case, if you have 10 kids with IEPs and you don't have the support in the classroom, it's gonna break down. And I feel like that's what we're experiencing is we're experiencing teachers that aren't supported in a scenario. You have individuals that are coming in unequipped, which means more work, and that's on top of all the other assignments and work that a teacher might have. So it's a train wreck, but if we can back up and add supports up front and help the parent to feel supported and educated about the process, I really feel that can alleviate some of the pressure and some of the turmoil between the teacher and the parent. It's not a perfect world, so this is not a silver bullet, but I do see this as a step in the right direction. And I can say firsthand, this is something that is not happening. And when I say basic information is unknown to some of these parents, it's basic information. Like I said, the IEP itself being a legal document is an aha moment for a lot of parents. There are parents that are supposed to be notified, I believe, 7 days prior to an IEP meeting and receive the IEP before that, almost none of them get that. So there are all these things that on paper we would say, oh, this should work this way, and they're not receiving that. And so trying to figure out how we can fix those systems and not say, oh, it's the teacher's fault or it's the district's fault. Like, the parents don't care about whose fault it is. They just want it fixed. And so, I don't know, someone's going to have to step up and say, okay, I'm willing to put the right measures in place so that we can get support up front for the teachers and parents so that the individuals are educated and can move forward and build a relationship and really work on the main things, accommodations, success in the classroom, support around behaviors in special ed. That's a whole nother topic. But that's kind of what I say.
Yeah, and I would just add that piece around it being a legal document. I mean, I really see it's almost like a conflict in values in a way. Families are going into the room wanting to figure out, like, how are we going to help my child feel more successful, be more successful, right? And from the school districts, it is a legal process and a legal document. Recently, for the first time, went to the Special Ed in the Law conference. It's like, talk about putting fear, right, into schools and districts around processes, and if you don't follow it, if you do something wrong, right? So there is all these components around how do we train, but also understanding at its core, like what one stakeholder group is expecting the process to be like, and then the information and training coming at the professionals and the fear around litigation and all of that, right? And so thinking about how does that play into the behavior then we see in that space, not pretending that that doesn't happen. And we do have a very stressed out education system, right? We have a lot of different things coming at them. And one of the challenges I see is we tend to think about separate groups of students when we talk about these issues, not recognizing a student and how the different systems move around them. A student with a disability receiving special education services may also be a student who's experienced trauma, may also be a student who's experiencing homelessness, may also be a student whose family recently moved to this country, right? And so how do all those systems then work in a coordinated and responsive way to serve that student? And often what we see is these special ed conversations very separated and isolated. And that's to the detriment of all students, frankly.
Yeah, and I would like to add something. For us, supporting the families is kind of difficult because we provide that general information that we get for the entire system. But when we come to one district, they have their own rules. So we say something in a different way, how that IP was graded, and then so the family are confusing, and then it is a lack of trust because they don't know to who they can believe, to the system, to the teacher, to the the special education supervisor who coming from the district, or to the ARC or Open Doors or other organization who we try to inform the families how the IP works. So because everybody grades the IP is different, so I think it is important to take in consideration to be in the same page and work together. We don't want to say something different that does have to do that in the way that we think it will be better. It is in the way that how the whole IBM team has supposed to be working on.
So I do have a question from a parent on this topic. She says, my youngest son is on an IEP plan that she knows absolutely nothing about. Where does she find copy of the rights for her and or her son, as well as is the school supposed to provide the parents with a copy of an IEP? I think you guys might have covered that a lot, but I just wanted to get that question.
Yes, I would say I'll jump in that once a student is identified or even evaluated, that's when the family should be given a copy of what's called their procedural safeguards. It's published by the state, and the districts are able to use that and reformat it or put it in a different package, but it's all the same information, and you're supposed to get that information. And it's available on our website publicly, and most school districts have it, from what I can tell, at least on their websites as well. But first and foremost, it should be handed to any student, any family who's eligible for special education should have received that most likely on multiple occasions, but at least at one time when they're determined eligible.
And so as you talked about assessments, are there assessments to ensure how students are being identified is accurate and not a result of racial bias?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about the bias load in assessments. And assessment developers have done work to try to rectify that. There still remains the issue of the variability within languages. There still remains that issue, but there are processes that assessment teams can use, such as one is using a nonverbal assessment to evaluate the child, but also to really understand that child's language and to identify what's the primary language that that child uses. And then evaluate them, use an interpreter when you have one, and or use a nonverbal assessment. But there are some evaluations that are normed for children who speak other languages, mostly some form of Spanish, but not a lot when you're talking about the other languages. So you're using nonverbal assessments. Did I answer everything on here?
Okay. So then my next question would be, as we talk about like racial bias and equity, is how does institutionalized racism in the education system intersect/affect special education students, especially like students of color?
You start, please.
It's a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think start as broadly or generally as possible. I mean, special education is not immune to the systemic bias, institutionalized racism that already exists within the education system in our society. So I think if you look at the data that we have statewide, it would reflect what we already see generally. So for instance, yes, we do have students of color who are disciplined at a higher rate or disproportionately versus students who are white students. In particular, the highest rates are for Black African American students or American Indian students. They tend to be disciplined in special ed. Those who are eligible for special ed are disciplined at higher rates. So there's parallels to what you see generally. I think, yes, there's a reflection in the identification of students who are eligible for special ed. So particular categories, there's over-identification of particular racial ethnic groups within particular categories. The most, I would say, egregious and significant, if you look at statewide data, is that all the English learners, those students who are dually eligible for English language program as well as special education, over half of those students who are in an English language program are identified as a student with a learning disability as well. So in essence, we're kind of saying not speaking English is a disability. And I think that's a reflection of the institutionalized kind of racism that we have. And so this over-identification of particular categories, and it affects different ethnic groups. So, I mean, I think we have started to unpack what the data is telling us, and we need to reflect that back out into the school system so that there's a recognition of the practices that are having, the conversation we're having in general education and more broadly in society. They're also reflected within special education too. And we need to start recognizing that and understanding how it's affecting our practice. Maybe more than we're seeing, that others have seen, but that's, I would say, that's generally we can't say is that special ed is not immune to what we're already seeing in terms of institutionalized racism and bias in our practices.
So I would say with the institutionalized racism, it's with it being a system. So what we were dealing with is a system that was built in where there's a lack of favor towards a specific group. So when you adopt that system, you actually have teachers who have to operate within that system. Oftentimes, the teacher takes the brunt of the abuse because they're doing their job. And I really feel if we're really going to see adequate change, we have to really ask ourselves, are we willing to change the system? If we are willing to do that, I feel we'll have fruitful results. But that, I mean, it seems like that would be a laborious task, but it just seems like the direction to go in. So we talk about a system that's not for people. We understand that we have data around how it is affecting families and students. If we look at Seattle Public Schools, not to put anyone on blast, you could take surveys and people would have a lot to say about their experience. And that's no disrespect to one particular person, but we're talking about families that are sharing their experience, sharing their hardships, needing support, and it seems as though it's not being heard. So the question is how could we change a system that isn't built for everyone?
Let me just add a little bit about what we're doing, starting to do. So we understand that part of this systemic problem came about with processes and the methodology that was used for evaluating students. And it's called the discrepancy method, where we look at a student's overall IQ, we give them a cognitive examination as well as achievement, and we look for a discrepancy between the two. We get this full scale IQ test, which had a lot of bias in it for children of color. We know that. So one of the things that we're doing right now in the state is exploring alternative models for evaluating these students. And one of those includes not looking at a full scale IQ for a student's ability and determining whether or not they have a learning disability. The current practices are looking at RTI, using RTI data that doesn't involve any cognitive evaluation at all. The other process does use cognitive examinations, but it's looking at within differences in the student and not an overall IQ, but we're looking for patterns of strengths and weaknesses within the student's cognitive ability to determine whether or not they have a learning disability. And a patterns of strengths and weaknesses model will help us with those students who are speakers of other languages. It does help that, but it helps us to pull away, hopefully, from this over-identification, pit that we've fell into, and unfair identification and inappropriate identification of students with learning disabilities, which is our highest category. So that's what we're doing. We have a cadre in which Sarah's on the cadre working with us. We're exploring that, presenting that to stakeholders across the state. We have school psychologists working, and school psychologists across the state are well aware of the issues with the evaluation method they've been using, and a majority of support for transition to break down that systemic barrier.
So one of the pieces, sorry.
Oh, no, I said fantastic.
Oh, so one of the pieces I would just add, so as we've heard, right, we have disproportionately high numbers of students of color, students in poverty represented within special education. When you then look at how our special education system works and the access students qualified for special education, the access they have to general education, it's poor, right? That's why we have a focus in our state, a recent focus on increasing inclusion. So if you're not in the general education classroom, you're not learning the content that then is tied to the standards, right? Which is needed in order to graduate with a typical diploma and have options for post-secondary. It has been striking to me, and I really believe, not by accident, that with siloing the special education conversation, we have been able to keep kids off the grid for the most part, right? Very low bars, low standards, low expectations, and it's disproportionately affecting communities and communities of color in our state. And so when we look at how we shift this, understanding the components of institutionalized racism and really getting behind organizations such as the EEC and the work that they're doing to dismantle these systems is critically important to moving forward the pieces around special education. I also don't think it's an accident when you look at just the history in education and when special education came online, right, during the other efforts to also desegregate schools, right? So special education in this state has been a place to get a kid out of a classroom and off the grid. I just have to wonder. I mean, I entered this advocacy work with curiosity, and in talking with educators who are on the front lines and administrators who are trying to stop the qualification of students of color based on just professional judgment, specifically because they believe the effort is to get kids off the grid, and they don't have a lot of cover for doing that work, right? So they're trying to stop these inequitable practices on the front lines. It's not always happening, and so they're the ones, the administrators, the ones getting the pushback. So I think understanding these components and first and foremost having a lens on the student and the experience and how do we help them, but also thinking about the systemic pieces, and for those in our system, the professionals in our system that are doing good work, how do we help bring cover to them? Because we have a pretty big shift that is happening and needs to happen in our state. And again, that transparency piece I feel like is huge.
Okay. So, and maybe you guys might not have the answer to this, but why do you feel it is that the suspension and discipline rates are higher for students with IEPs in schools?
I'll go ahead and jump right on it. I think part of it gets back to this concept of inclusion and exclusion. And you have to understand that up until the early 70s, kids were assessed. They were assessed, are you someone who can be educated? Are you someone who can be trained? Are you someone who should be shut away in an institution? And this was the norm. You did not have to let somebody into your school. And then the law changed and they had to let you into the school, but there wasn't necessarily, it was very uneven about whether you would be welcomed, whether there would be a sense of belonging. And we still pretty systematically categorize people. You're worthy of this. Maybe you can do that. You can go over here. And in addition to racism, we have a lot of ableism in our society, and especially in Washington. We have a lot of ableism. And I think that intersects with the behavior, because you have children who are really diverse and they're really different, and sometimes they're complex. Mm-hmm. And they communicate differently. It gets into things like communication as behavior and basically not understanding what somebody's trying to say. And there's a lot of different components that come together, but behavior and how people communicate and understand each other is part of it. But then I think at the root of it, we still have this ingrained, as a culture, we've never addressed the ableism that we have, and that we feel like some people really don't belong, or they can come in to a certain extent. And we still get this. It's just from the get-go, when parents are coming in, it's, well, we'll put you here until you can work up here, which is not what the law is at all. The law is, you're here in a general education environment. Special education is the sport to keep you in that general education environment. If that environment doesn't work for you, well then we'll go work. That's how it's supposed to work. But that's not how it works. How it works is, oh, you're that, we're gonna do this over here. And maybe you can work up to getting into an inclusive education. And so I think the fact that we've turned this law inside out, it's misapplied all the time, openly. Every district administrator knows it. Nothing happens through decades of injustice. All that just comes to play. I'm kind of getting off the topic, but that's, yeah, I think it gets back to the ableism, and it gets back to communication.
So then, in dealing with IEPs, 504s, discipline, what kind of educational outreach to the public do y'all's organizations or just other organizations out there, what are they doing so the struggle is not just on the families of special education students, but on society as a whole?
What are we doing?
Yeah, like what kind of outreach are organizations doing in like communities to help, parents and families and communities that don't necessarily understand the education system as much, or IEPs, like what kind of outreach and education is going on in communities to turn that struggle to a society struggle? Like you said, it's everyone's job, not just parents or teachers.
So, poster boy.
So one of the things we're doing is we started an inclusion academy. You've heard this phrase, kindergarten readiness. So, which is a phrase, by the way, a lot of parents do not like, especially parents with children with disabilities. But there's also like, what does it mean to be for a parent to be kindergarten ready? And when you have a child with a significant disability, oh my goodness, there's a whole lot you need to know. You need to understand disability as diversity. You need to understand your legal rights. You need to understand what an IEP looks like. You need to understand all this stuff that a normal school experience, you don't think is part of a normal school experience. And so one of the things that we're doing is we have a class for incoming preschool parents, trying to start getting them into inclusive placements in early learning. Because once you're in a segregated environment, it is very difficult to get out of it. So you want to keep them in an integrated environment from the get-go. So that's one aspect, is to start early, and I pointed to it. And then also we do a lot of, you're also in the IEP parent partner training, aren't you? Yeah, and so we do IEP parent partner training, and then I'll hand it over, you guys can talk about.
So last year, or early on, feels like a year ago, so much has happened this year. We did our first African American family support around IEP partner training. So our IEP parent partner training is essentially, we train families from point A to Z as much as we can. We cram as much as we can into that training regarding how to understand and support your child with an IEP. And then once they pass that class, they're then certified and they're on a parent list where when we get calls in regarding supports needed and needing to hear other experiences and be walked through things, we pair them with those parents, and it's been, they've had a really fruitful experience from that. As far as advertising goes, they find us. So we're in a world where, word of mouth is really heavy, and parents are really in need of support. So a lot of times, we have this great program, but a lot of times our phones are being blown up, and we're trying to catch up and unravel and support. So that's kind of the rhythm that we're consistently in.
Yeah, and we do the same thing in Spanish for the families, and also adding to that thing, and Richard is mentioning it, we also support the families before the IEP. We try to help them to understand the IEP if there is an issue that the family is facing before the IEP meeting. So we work with them and see what is the things that the family wants to talk, and the IEP to come in with agenda and be well prepared and feel like empowered to talk with the whole IEP team and see if they come with a solution. If there is not a positive thing happening on the IEP meeting, so we starting coming with the parents to the school IEP meetings. We don't do that much because we don't have a time, we don't have a budget for that. That's why I try to empower the families in advance, and also with the parent-to-parent IEP parent partner trainings to make sure that they have more information from different ways, but in Spanish as well.
I'd also just like to tack on, we do a lot of coalition work. So we work with other coalitions that aren't increasingly not necessarily disability affiliated, to try to educate them about some of the needs are. And it's a challenge because it's a challenge, but we try to do a lot of coalition work.
Yeah, I would just, a lot of the outreach I've done, one of the pieces I recognize is that if I wanted students with disabilities included more, I needed to focus on the general education side of things and those education advocacy organizations that are engaging with families, but not necessarily families of children who have disabilities. And so one of the things we've done is often when we go to even a school or district level, make sure that there's both families of students who are receiving special education services as well as families of students who are not. And what's interesting is that you can have two families with kids in the same classroom, and they don't recognize that there are vastly different realities that are being experienced if one of those children has an IEP and one doesn't. And so when the families who have the children with the IEP start talking about, my child doesn't get access to art, my child doesn't get access to science because they're always getting yanked out, or they're getting yanked out in the middle of the class, families can appreciate that because they're like, well, my kid loves art and science. How can that be? And it's been interesting how communities come together to support each other in the advocacy and really start to shift that culture. So I say all the time, we can inadvertently continue the segregation and the isolation through our advocacy work. So how do we really start to break that down is really important.
So I'll just mention a couple of ways that we do outreach. One, we do have like webinars that we host. Parents are able to participate in those on occasion. Some of them are for district's content area. We do have a wealth of resources on our websites for parents, including things about the IEP process. We have a special education advisory committee where parents come together and they're able to dialogue about process and decisions about advice about which way we should go, recommendations. Each district also should have one of those. The last way we reach out to parents, I'll mention, is that through our monitoring process that we do across the state with school districts, that part of that process includes a parent survey so that we take that information that we receive from parents. We do parent focus groups if we're doing an on-site monitoring of a school district. If we're doing a desk review, then we still have the survey and we provide that information back to the school district for their program improvement.
Right, and I'd say part of my job is to also kind of direct traffic if there's parents calling the state office to back out to the organizations in the community that may be the most helpful and on the ground. And the one thing I'd add, because the original question had talked a little bit about discipline, I mean, we're in the midst of a kind of a shift. I mean, I would say a pretty significant shift in mindset statewide around discipline generally. The state has rewritten, revised the general rules within the state around discipline. And there's resistance to that because there's a lot of vestiges of old practices around the concept of zero tolerance, stereotypes about student behavior, particularly ones who are on an IEP, and the stress that the school systems are feeling with regard to the lack of resources, going back to what we mentioned about funding as well. And that it's, yes, there's a lot that needs to be happening around the conversations around discipline and when is it appropriate and when is it not, and how can discipline be less punitive and more restorative and more preventative and more proactive. I get asked to participate with our general education counterparts a lot because I think what was mentioned already is important, that there are the voices of students who have disabilities either on 504 or IEP who are kind of left out of the conversation of how discipline may impact them in a general ed setting or in a general concept. And so I think the more that community organizations, we try to do what we can, and the more parents can organize and reach out, the state office will definitely try to direct folks to the resources that we mentioned on our website, or even the ones that we know of in the community, so that there's just a more power to the voice. But you would, if you haven't already experienced it, there is an ongoing conversation and some resistance to the idea that the way we approach discipline in this state is changing, and it's already started. So there's more to talk about in particular, and it definitely affects students who are on IEPs as well.
Okay, so I'm going to combine these two. Equity is all about adding resources and eliminating barriers. Where are there opportunities for both? As in, what are some big system changes going on right now? What are policies that are either in place now or that are going to be pushed for this upcoming legislative session that people can look into?
Well, I'll talk about one of the things that we did approaching equity is the big inclusion work. And this was from legislation last year where there was $25 million added for us to do an inclusion project. And so we've identified several districts across the state where we looked at their restrictive environment or their least restrictive environment, where students were during the school day, and tried to send that message and do a shift of mindset, offering training to start to get folks to move these children from more restrictive environments to less restrictive environments. So it's about changing mindsets, beliefs, and expectations around the students' abilities and their right to access general education. I like what you mentioned earlier. It's It's not about a student having to earn their way into the general education classroom. That's their right to be in general education classroom. And what we're doing is sending that message across the state, and we're supporting that we want districts to be doing more inclusion or having more inclusionary practices. Part of that may be the student in the classroom. That's one way they can do that. There's co-teaching, a number of ways that districts can instill inclusionary practices.
And we also are big proponents, by the way, we love the inclusion project, and it's great. Because we got the state funding, and then there's also a federal grant, so it's just a sea shift in terms of how it feels around support. But also, we're really excited by ideas like universal design for learning, which is basically, it's like, so there were like 2 special education bills last year, and neither one of us, we couldn't get excited in my organization about either one of them, because they were about, I mean, they had good suggestions, but they were basically about how to help people navigate this really complicated system. And it's like, honestly, we would rather not have such a horribly complicated system. It's like, why should we have, if we know we're pushing all these different people to the margins, and those would include English language learners, people, different races and cultures and different abilities, we know that we have all kinds of data that shows we're pushing them out. So why don't we rethink the way we're doing education to make it more accessible from the get-go? And there's a lot of evidence around that. We see this in practice. It's a newer thing in the sense that it's not 100 years old, but it's not a brand new thing where there isn't any research around it either. And so we're really excited by the idea of encouraging schools to, well, maybe you should design for accessibility, and maybe that would solve some of our problems. You wouldn't have so much contention if they weren't so pushed out of the system to start with.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, universal design for learning is incredibly beneficial for students with disabilities, but also English learners and frankly, all students, right? And it's an example of there's multiple components that we should just lay into the system for all students. That is going to just really help kind of beef up that foundation so that when kids pop up into these other areas of needing more support, there isn't such a significant gap, right? Because we've had that stronger foundation. In terms of policy, I wanted to touch on that, the mention, Liz, of the local SEAC. So the Special Education Advisory Council that she mentioned at the state level, it's interesting because within the Special Education Law, IDEA, one of the requirements is that states have a Special Education Advisory Council, and it's required to be at least 50% parents, right? But the reality is when you have, and I was on that committee for 4 years, when you have a committee that meets at the state level and our committee travels and it's for 2 days, that means you have to travel, be away from your children, right? You have a job, leave your job. So there's a lot of barriers, I guess is what I'm saying, to parents accessing. So what we see is it's an amazing committee of amazing people, but a lot of people may work in a school system or work for an advocacy organization and then also be a parent, right? So there's that kind of 2 hats. So I think all the time about how do we, even through those structures, engage community voice. And one of the bills Ramona was mentioning from last session had a component in there around local special education advisory councils. So at a district level. And what's interesting is our state actually used to fund that type of work, and that went away some time ago. There are some districts that have a local council, but for the most part, they're absent. When I think about the inclusionary practices work that our state is funding and that work that needs to happen in districts, how powerful would it be for districts to bring together parents and educators within that system, and again, be able to start to appreciate the different perspectives and realities experienced and think about how do we work together to move this work forward. I think it could go a long way to starting to repair relationships and build relationships. Most importantly, everybody's on the same page with what's coming. Because this may be shocking after everything you've heard today. There's no trust.
It is
right?
to say.
There's no trust. And we can't say, well, now that we're going to do this differently, everything needs to be forgotten. It's very personal for a lot of people, educators and parents alike, right? What's happened. So we can't ignore that social emotional piece. We can't ignore that repairing relationship piece and rebuilding relationships. And we don't support people with skills on how to do that as well as we should. So I think it's a critically important component that ties into all these different pieces that need to move forward.
Awesome. So before I open it up to audience questions, was there anything that you guys, any other information you guys would like to share? Okay, perfect. So, if anyone has any questions? And I just say yes. Go.
I'm wondering about the intersectionality between behavioral health and special education. A lot of, that we know that trauma can elicit the need for special education, but it might not be this, the same as what people think. Like my daughter has emotional behavior disorder, the highest level of trouble thinking, whatever. And she didn't have a counselor as part of her IEP. Like, to me, this idea that we segment siloing education from the whole child is part of the problem that we're talking about. And do you guys have ideas about how do we move towards seeing the whole person as opposed to, well, I've literally been told school refusal is your problem, Mom. There's no village for my child when she's having a problem. It's up to me. How do we move that dialogue forward? And maybe we disagree that that's part of special education. I'd like to know.
So I'll chime in just briefly. I've had the privilege of sitting on a number of different committees related to both special education components, mental health, social emotional components, and then general education components. And what's striking to me again is that siloing that happens around the issues. And so you can have these different committees talking about the same thing and not recognizing it. I really feel strongly that we are at a point, and it's probably overdue, where we sit and understand how systems move around a child. So instead of thinking about the issue, let's think about some different case studies of kids and how systems move around them. And then look inwardly at how, whether at a state level or at a district level, we're structuring how we address these issues. And maybe we need to change some of those structures. Because when you look to our legislative process, what I often experience is this separation. So we're talking about investments needed in mental health. We're talking about investments needed in special ed. It almost becomes a pecking order, not understanding how there's some intersections within those two issues that we should double down on, right? And there's never a space to recognize that other than people, and there's many of them that speak up to it, but because, no, we deal with mental health here, we deal with special ed here.
Funding streams. This is the, Department of Education, this is Medicaid, or this is your private insurance. Yeah. And that becomes a barrier, like nobody can do anything about it. But that's part of breaking down the system and stop saying we can't do anything about it. But we're the voters, we're the people that run this country, theoretically. What do we do about it?
One of the things that I can say is that's been enjoyable since my time coming on with OSBI is this shift and the separation and the working in silos, that we do more across the aisle collaboration. In fact, with our group, we have a mental health person, a nurse who serves on our team, who often gives us input as we're talking about special education issues and the needs of students. There's also a counterpart in our office. He is working with a group, and I can't speak intelligently about it, just enough to tell you that there is a collaboration between special education and those with mental health and looking at that whole issue, because we do realize it's a huge issue across the state. I can give you his name is Lee Collier. If you want specific information about the work that they're doing, you can contact him. Lee Collier, OSBI.
Any other questions?
How do we eliminate isolation?
Isolation. Is that what you said?
I think he said, how do we eliminate isolation?
Yeah, the question was, how do we eliminate isolation rooms? Well, I mean, I assume you asked the question because of the fact that in our state we have a prohibition against the use of isolation and restraint on students.
We do.
Right, it's prohibited except in cases where there is an imminent likelihood of serious harm.
How did Shadle Park happen?
I'm not familiar exactly with Shadle Park, this was the one you're referring to.
Well, there was a student that was put into an isolation room, and she came out of the isolation room with trauma. She beat her head against a steel door. And so she's taken out of the isolation room and she's put into a hospital. And she can't be removed from the hospital because there's no place to have her to be educated. My understanding is that there are states that don't have isolation rooms. I'd like to see Washington be in that group.
Right, right. And I hope we're moving towards that. But as far as from a legislative perspective,
Yeah.
it's recently been implemented in the
It
sense
has?
that the sort of severe restrictions on when isolation or the use of restraint would ever be used is, like I said, it's essentially prohibited except in cases where there's eminent likelihood of serious harm. And so I think that's where there needs to be more education around what is an eminent likelihood of serious harm and training about how to respond that does not involve the use of an isolation room or any kind of restraint that would harm a student.
I just would like to add on a couple components to that. So we have as a state been moving, right, to decrease the use of that. Those processes, they are extremely traumatic for the students that are experiencing it and for the students around them that are seeing. I've had families reach out that say, my daughter keeps talking about a kid screaming, don't put me in the closet, right? Like, what would that be about? Happens all the time. And here's the thing, we say we're trying to lessen it, but the reality is when you look, if you're in a district where you're building, one of your school buildings may be being rebuilt, right, or remodeled, you can look at the plans and you see they're still building these rooms into spaces, right? So if we're trying to reduce the use of them, and again, it's disproportionately happening to students, especially students on the autism spectrum. And so it's an issue that we, again, as a community need to come together around. I think it speaks to the need for stronger supports and understanding around behavior in classrooms. It speaks to staffing and training, right? And how do we equip adults within the system to be able to respond to this? It definitely is anchored in bias around behavior. Some of the reasons why kids get put in these spaces is ridiculous, frankly, and it takes transparency. And it's just been recently, as Scott was mentioning, with the law change, that now you can see reporting and data around it, and you can identify if it's happening in your community. And I would say speak up, right? And I think when you look at other states, they've shifted. I know in California where isolation is no longer allowed whatsoever, they still allow in very limited instances restraint. But this, I would challenge any adult that thinks it's a good thing to go into that room. You go in there, what you smell, what you see, it's horrific, and it's unacceptable that it's happening. So.
Any more questions?
I would add too that some districts now are actually asking staff to move the entire class out of the room instead of the student who's struggling. So to give that student the space that they need in a known environment, and then have someone who's trained to work with that student meet their needs in their general education classroom. So I've seen, classrooms doing their independent reading in the hallway as their friend gets the services that they need. And it doesn't necessarily stop learning, but it prevents that child from having to go into a more traumatic environment. My question was, this has been really informative, thank you all. With the upcoming legislative session, I'm sure there's lots of parents and advocates heading to Olympia. The parent group that I'm part of believes that if we center the needs of our most marginalized students, we are serving the needs of all of our students. I believe the concept is targeted universalism, which sounds in line with this other idea you mentioned, universal design for learning. So as we approach legislators and we'll be talking about money, our belief is that we do need to fund general education in a different way to support students with special needs. What do you want us to ask them for? We'll have a very short period of time. What would you go in asking for?
I would say they need funding structures in place that really address the whole child component. You need to be able to have mental health support. You need to be able to have counseling support. You need to have some really good mobile technical assistance that can go into school districts to give them training so that the staff feels that they have the tools that they need to work with the students that they have.
I recognize that we have significant gaps in special education funding. And so the pieces that Ramona mentioned earlier around how do we need to lift the cap, we need to increase special education funding. But I will say, I believe that needs to be looked at as a stopgap measure. I think the real issue is that we need to, and I know this is going to excite people, we need to relook at the basic education funding. The fact of the matter is McCleary wasn't focused on equity, and it didn't keep students at the center of the conversation until we have a funding formula that meets students' needs and is driven by students' needs and communities. We can tinker all we want with all these other layered formulas, special ed and otherwise, and we're still going to see this gap. And when you really start to look at the gaps, you can't drive money where it needs to go through our formulas, which speaks to the fact that it wasn't designed around equity. You start overfunding some of the districts, and still other districts are underfunded. So I know legislators aren't going to love to hear that, but I think it's critically important that we build a shared narrative around this and start pushing.
If they were to amend, I'm not sure if that's the right language, McCleary, though, what it would be to re-examine the funding structures?
You know what I would honestly say is McCleary, they didn't think about students with disabilities, and I question what other groups may have been left out, right? This was all kept separate. So McCleary, oh, sorry, Sharon. Yes.
So I would strongly recommend that you talk about McCleary. So the only way that I would recommend talking about McCleary is to say that McCleary doesn't work. It's not working. It hasn't worked. It's not a system set up for children at all. The funding formula doesn't work for our kids, for any kids, unless you are part of a CIS heteronormative Christian white family, which is, in your upper middle class where you can support your child in any way, shape, or form. But when we are talking about funding, one of the things that Sarah had once mentioned to me was that every child has the right for general ed, right? And that every child then has the right to general ed funding, and that special ed should sort of come in and support that child. And it sort of changed the way we started looking at general ed funding, because we always keep talking, and the two, Ramona and Sarah had alluded to this earlier, we keep separating general ed from special ed and from ELL and HICAP and transitional learning instruction, and they all should be the same pot money, right? But we keep talking about, we have this small teeny tiny little pie, and the reality is that we've been given this small teeny tiny little pie out of a huge pie that somebody else is using. So when 52% of the state budget goes to education, we know that 52% of it is not being allocated to our kids in any way, shape, or form. So what we need to start doing is forget McCleary. Like, McCleary was done, it's over, it's a mess, and it's a problem. But we have to start over with a completely brand new Basic Education Act, Basic Education funding. Okay, I'm done.
Could I add to that, having been working in behavioral health advocacy and sitting on children's mental health workers at the state level, it's pretty clear that part of the problem is the way that we have our regressive tax structure in our state. And Noel Frame from the 36th district is working on trying 5-year plan to rebuild that from the ground up. So talking to our legislators across all districts that we are not satisfied with the way that we, just keep having a shortage-based system of funding when we are one of the wealthiest states as far as, exports over imports, that we need to change how we're funding everything in our state. So it's a 1930s tax system that was set up as a temporary system, and they never fixed it. It's time to fix the taxes.
I did. I heard Richard first talk about maybe it would be helpful if we had a revolution in the system, or a big change, a sea change, right? And Liz said the same thing alone. And in math, we've been needing this for a long time. We leave 80% of kids behind in math. We've weaponized it and we're injuring people. The passage of SB 5023, the Ethnic Studies Bill, has given us this thing that we finally need. So we're going to die on this hill maybe, but we're going all in. Where as long as it doesn't become ethnic studies, something we do for a week in February, as long as it's a whole school thing, we think there's actually a vehicle we can use to decolonize fundamentally change how we're doing math. The question is that something that could work for special ed to look at SB 5023 and think, man, let's make this a whole school, not a February thing, a whole school thing, and try to let that be the vehicle. Because I know we'll be there with you on that. That's what they're doing in Seattle and lots of other places. Wonder if we could make the revolution happen through that FGEN studies.
I think all of that, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I think all of those components are critical, right? I mean, when we think about what Ramona was mentioning with universal design, so when you're looking at this process as curriculums are being identified or developed, understanding universal design and the components that come into play is only going to increase access. In addition, when I think about decolonizing these components within curriculum and these programs, students start to see their identity, and students hold multiple identities. So how do you make sure a positive and healthy disability identity is also incorporated, right, within the curriculums? So absolutely all of these components, and again, just thinking about that disability identity as well as accessing the curriculum, and that's in terms of accessing it from what is presented to how they show their work, thinking about the physical space and ability to access, thinking about the sensory components, right? The academic components, all of that. But absolutely, it's a vehicle.
But I would also add to that, when taking that route, I think the families, talking with the families, and really not assuming what the experience should be, but actually finding out what the experience needs to be. So a lot of times we say these things that sound amazing and it sound like, you know, a real kumbaya moment and everybody's going to be happy, but we haven't talked to the families that are actually in the schools and say, what do you need? How can we support you? Ultimately, who are you? Have we misjudged you, mislabeled you? How can we go in a different direction through connecting while building? So both of those things have to be in place when going in those directions. We have to get a strong sense of who we're really talking to. And I think that is missing.
Yeah.
And I would also just quickly add, often what I notice is that as parents of young people with disabilities, we're brought into spaces, but we actually need to be talking to people with disabilities and talking to young people with disabilities, right? Because the parent perspective in that, navigating that experience does not equate to actually being an individual with a disability.
Hi, I'm a parent of a student, had two students with special needs. And one of them ended up through the JRA system. Anyway, I'm in the Federal Way School District. But there were some issues at their school. Basically labeling of minority students. So anyway, he's got his GED, became parents, a child of the JRA system. So the access for these students that are JRA students on special education, they're not getting their education when they are in JRA. And they're not being taught what they need to be taught. So it took him a while before someone even showed up and to make sure that he was being taught while he was in JRA. So consequently, he ended up getting his GED finally when he was out at Green Hills. And smart kid, but anyway, I'm more or less concerned about designing accessibility for students of special needs that are wanting to be in GE, general ed, but yet those students who are desiring to have that accessibility, they don't have the mentorship in the school districts available to help mentor those students because they're going to need extra support when they are GE students. And not only that, some of the teachers in the GE program, they welcome the students into the GE classes. However, they are not fully equipped or know how to deal with students with special needs. And so that's the frustrating part of it all, because you have these students that are special needs that are well below the GE standard criteria. And then you're putting them in GE classes at a later date. My daughter, she didn't get into a regular GE class until she was probably 15. And then she was determined to have autism. So consequently, she is now in a program at Achieve at Highline. And she's still struggling at that level because there's not enough support. So all around, it's not just starting younger when they are younger. That accessibility and need for support has to follow them all the way through their educational process. And we need to make sure that the parents are aware of what that support is like. And that the schools, even though that they are in college, on a college campus, that they're wanting these students then and young adults to be independently handling their own criteria or meeting with their teachers. But yet there's not enough support there to manage these kids properly in these special education or higher education programs. So funding should start when they are younger, and it should follow them all the way through their process, through the transitional process. And that's the biggest thing that I see is that we're grateful for the federal school district handling her funding while she's on the college campus. However, there's that accessibility and the support that needs to be strengthened. And so that's one of the biggest things that I see that is an issue, is the lack of support. We talk general inclusion, and that's wonderful, but we need to see as parents more visualization of that accessibility as well as support for our students. So however you propose, or is there any way that you can, it's not gonna work for my daughter because she's almost done with her transitional process, but what can you do to, or how can we ensure that other parents are not having to struggle with their kiddos when they are ready to go on beyond high school?
Something that I encourage all the time to the parents, the most early they can start to understand how the system works is gonna be better, because they wanna know what the words key will help them to find the services for put in the right place. But if they weren't on that time, the most important is understand how the IEP work has been writing, and where is going to be the right people to talk and how to talk. It is the only way that parents can get what they need for their kids. Find the right people and put in the work that it helps them to put in place. Because if they don't understand what is the work that will be identify the issue of the students, I don't know if it is something that staff is they are using for avoid to help the students, or it is because even they don't understand as well how to deal with that issue. Most of the times what we hear from the staff, it is the funding. Funding is the only word that is come up all the time. But if the students have a difficult and challenge with whatever, it doesn't supposed to be that thing that is gonna be, we have to discuss. It is not a problem for the parents to know that. It is the staff who have to deal with that. But if the IP is not writing in the right place, that has to be clear for everybody. So that's why the families have the same issue. Like,
and I would just, oh, sorry, Ramona. I'm going to just do a brief overarching comment because there was a lot of components in what you brought up. One, special education funding. So if a child qualifies for special education funding is delivered, it does not go if they go into a juvenile, into juvenile justice. That funding doesn't follow them. That is trying to be addressed, but that's an issue. So then the student isn't accessing their education services in that setting. my only comment would be, what we're talking about is like an ecosystem around special education, educating young people with disabilities, I guess is a better way actually to frame it. And I don't think we can understand what a healthy ecosystem would even look like when we have been a state that for so long has separated, siloed, segregated students. So I really think that we see inclusionary practices work happening and starting to be built at different demonstration sites. That's going to start to give us some better insight. But really, we need to look outside of our state and always question what's normal. It's normal because it's been our experience, but is that actually okay?
I have a question that is
Can I-
related to that.
I want to do a sort of a technical response to what you're saying. So your daughter's she's in a transition program and it's taking place at Highline. So does she still have an IEP plan or a program?
still has an IEP.
So I would say, the good thing about having an IEP is that you can write in the support so that if she's actually not able to access the general education environment and she needs supports for that, then you can look to the IEP and you can look to have some sort of support perhaps written into the IEP.
Yeah, there is that component written into the
Okay.
IEP. However, we know when it's on paper, it's a
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
different ballgame.
Yeah.
So
So
that's
that's-
reality.
yeah.
And so that's what my concern is getting it off of paper
And
and
then
making
implement it.
sure that it's
Yeah.
following our
Yeah.
students into the classroom.
Yeah.
Because it's not there.
Yeah, and I would say on that one then, and won't solve your problem or won't help your daughter today, but sort of from a system solution, is there just needs to be some sort of way of doing basically accountability so that we're assessing like, are we actually what are the success rates of these IEPs that we're writing? There needs to be some sort of way of auditing. It's like, are we just writing these goals down on paper? Or are they actually being implemented? And if they're not being implemented, what are the hangups? Because sometimes it's like we go to funding, and I'm not suggesting that we don't need funding, but sometimes some really good targeted technical support could do some good work. I mean, if you need more staffing, it's not going to solve the problem of more staffing, but if it's in terms of like not understanding how to work for a certain thing, or you need some more, sometimes some targeted support can actually be very, very helpful. And we tend to not sort of go into a situation and sort of assess. Like, we could go into a school environment, theoretically, and we could assess it. We say, okay, so is it accessible? And then not just by ramp accessible, but like lighting, like if somebody with different sensibilities was coming in here, it's like, how accessible is this environment? How accessible is the learning? I mean, we could do audits of our learning environments to say, all right, if you have a learner who really kind of needs some extra mental health support or some more counseling, or like, do we actually have the infrastructure? And we write these nice plans, but we don't sort of like have a follow-up to sort of audit that and check that and say, are we following through on what we need to do? Because if we had that, then we would have a better sense of, it's like, how much more money do you need? Because legislators, I mean, everybody's asking for money. It's like, how much money do you need? What do you need it for? You need some more specifics. And to get that, we need to have a way of assessing the effectiveness of these IEPs. There needs to be some sort of, I hate the word accountability these days, but there needs to be some sort of check on that process. Evaluation check, not necessarily like it's a good, a bad, and I judge you check, but
Will you write, work with us?
sure, let's put together.
Let's work on
Yeah,
doing
good
that,
track record.
seriously.
I think it might be part of the resource allocation review that's required under ESSA, the new federal legislation. So they've been offering webinars that are really educational, but every district should be doing this.
Yeah, well, you do, like, then they have this sort of mindset around, like, if you have students who are struggling and they're not passing their tests, and you get targeted as one of the bottom schools, and then you get, sort of technical support to turn it around. I mean, they're doing it
It's
now, but
back to the education you mentioned, sir, that parents don't know up front. So
Yeah.
there are safeguards in place, but someone like myself who's middle income, white, works part-time, very involved with my kids' school, I'm just getting this stuff, right? So it's ridiculous to assume that many of our parents even have access or know what to ask for.
Yeah.
But I specifically wanted to ask the folks from OSPI about the 4-day count that OSPI uses around enrollment. Is that the right language? 4-day count, you count students on the 4th day of school every year? Or you expect districts to report back to the state on their enrollment the 4th day of class.
If I understand, you're talking at the beginning of school?
Yeah.
Right, okay, yeah.
I just want to make sure, as I'm learning, I want to make sure that we're on the same page before I ask my question. So I'm under the impression that building administrators report to the district their student enrollment numbers on the fourth day of class, and then those numbers get reported to OSPI. The issue that I've seen, and it's not just in my district, but in our neighboring districts as well, is that the paperwork that's used for those counts is segregated. There's a general education count and there's a special education count. And so although my students' teachers have students with special needs on their rosters, their general education rosters, in theory, they are part of that homeroom. They're only counted for funding based on this physically separate full form. And what happens in buildings is when we report separately, those students, 10 of which in my school, didn't get included in the general enrollment numbers, so we lost a teacher, which then impacted 250 students, right? So we're really purposefully erasing kids from even getting a number in the first place by tracking them separately. And the rationale up until this point has been because the funding streams are separate. So back to what you were saying, if special ed was funded as a component of basic education, because you all have said that general education is every student's right, then we shouldn't be tracking them separately and funding them separately. We should be funding them in general education unless that truly isn't the least restrictive effect.
They are funded in general, they are, every student,
But
every
we're not
student gets a
reporting
basic.
that way, and then when we say our services, our students aren't getting, they're not getting access to, like, they're missing core instruction, they're missing science, they're not getting the access that they need or deserve in general education. They're saying, well, for X, Y, and Z, they've been determined to need to receive their services in an ILC room, integrated learning center,
I'm not sure technically what you're saying is correct.
Yeah, it sounds like
Because
there's a
that's not
problem
how
with
they-
how they're doing it.
Yeah, they figure
Does that
every.
not make sense that if we write their names down separately?
No,
Right,
but
but
that's
that
not how it
process is
happens.
problematic. They shouldn't be
I
writing,
don't
and
know
that's not,
But that's not how they count, that's not how they do enrollment.
That's how we did enrollment.
that's right.
Yeah.
What I'm questioning is if in the district, the process that they're using is problematic, if like that's what's
Does
happening.
it not sound similar to how other districts would count enrollment?
No.
Okay, so I need to research that.
Yeah.
So from OSPI then, what is, just real quick, I don't want to take up too much space, but how should we be counting students?
Well, that every student does get counted as a basic education student in terms of a head count first. And then there's supplemental count or supplemental funding that supports up to the amount of 13.5 or 9, 30.5% for special education funding. It is based on the annual average head count for basic ed first. You have to get a basic ed.
FTE staffing.
Yeah, that might be a building level. I've seen that happen in districts where it's a building level or a district decision around maximum number of students. And so if they're separating
Right.
it's skewing the numbers and then, but it's
And
not a
after that,
state
there may
funded.
be a union contract around how that's being decided within the district. So,
I can.
right, so I mean,
I'll table
the
mine.
money will, it's gonna start big and then get smaller as it gets
But
down
from
to
a state level, I think I'm hearing that all students should be reported on their general education roster for,
basic
enrollment.
education first, right? Because you can't do the special ed formula unless you have the basic ed,
you can't get to the 13.5% if you don't know your total student.
unless you know your annual average head count, yes,
Okay.
for your basic ed.
Got it.
So that's where the 13% comes from. It's based off of the general ed count first and foremost. So that does sound odd that they would be doing that way. And I would suspect it's a district practice that
Well,
they could contact
district leaders
OSPI
have
for.
said, oh, this isn't unfamiliar to me. I've come from Bellevue. I've come from Seattle. This is how we do this.
Yeah, even if they do it in Bellevue, it's not necessarily.
And if they tell you that's how they do, they
Yeah.
might just be lying.
Well, then
Or
we have a
someone may
whole
not be
other problem.
explaining
I
it
need to talk
correctly.
to y'all.
Well, there's
Right.
that.
They may not be
That's very
explaining it
generous.
correctly because there is a separate form, yes, to report your special ed head count. And the head count's done monthly, there's a 4-day, there's an account at the beginning of school, that 4-day, like within the first 4 days, and then every month there's another account that's added. So the numbers are constantly being reported. Because then we can go down another rabbit hole about that, because there's other issues that come up.
I think what you're illustrating though is there's going to be a real need to look at a lot of different processes and kind of the way we've been doing business. I mean, I think about even the accountability piece Ramona was bringing up, and we have processes for auditing districts around special education, reviewing IEPs, but we have been a state historically that's been focused on compliance. So making sure the paperwork, right? And in a lot of ways, segregating the kids has lent well to that process because it's super easy to show you're getting specially designed instruction if you're in a different room on a different curriculum. We can say it's special, right? And so I would really think about the fact that we need to look at all systems, including how we audit and all those different processes in place. And does that communicate a commitment to increasing outcomes for our students with disabilities, or does that inadvertently uphold the system of segregation of our students?
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate you coming out and sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you to our audience members. This wouldn't happen if it wasn't for you guys coming and participating with us. So yeah, that's the end of